Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people-to-people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. This is the third episode of our West Asia series, which is dedicated to covering the latest developments out of Palestine and the Arab-Iranian region more broadly. The Gaza genocide has pushed against the bounds of what humanity will allow and has heightened the contradiction between the Western system of death making and the rest of the world's popular will for peace, development, and the right to life. So it is all the more important to continue the coverage on the situation. I'm joined as usual by my co-host Raven, whose work you can find at ravensreflections.substack.com and on Instagram at In Defense of Liberation. I will leave that linked in the description below. Today we have on Tara Alami. She is an organizer with the Palestinian Feminist Collective and is a writer. You can find her work at taraalami at .substack.com. Again, I'll leave that linked in the description below. In this episode, we discuss the state of the so-called ceasefire thus far, the state of Palestinian politics at this critical juncture. We talk about Palestinian political prisoners, as well as how we must continue to resist Zionism in the West. I'll once again shout out Lifeline for Gaza. This is where you can contribute money to families on the ground in Gaza. The website bumps up fundraisers that have not received a donation in the past 5 days. You can also contribute to the Samir Project, which is a vital network in Gaza for distributing food, water, and tents. They have several campaigns ongoing, and again, I'll leave that linked in the description below. This is a crucial time to donate to Palestinians on the ground, whether that be individual families or through a network or organization like the Samir Project. In this phase of the post ceasefire, so-called, this is really when aid is more necessarily needed, is able to get in. Hopefully there are fewer hurdles, to actualizing that aid on the ground. So, it is all the more important that we continue to support at a time like this. Lastly, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Also share this with others who could benefit from learning the latest updates in Palestine and West Asia. And without further ado, here's our conversation with Tara. Hi, Tara. Welcome to the International Solidarity Podcast. Thank you for making the time to be here. This is I guess the third instance or third episode of our West Asia series. We're, trying to follow up on the situation, follow the situation, and to continue to cover it. I think we wanted to start out by discussing the so-called ceasefire. Where are we at? What is the state right now? I guess, the latest I've seen is that, there's a yellow line being physically marked in the Gaza Strip. The occupation is bringing these bright yellow colored cement blocks and marking this yellow line within the strip that the IOF is supposedly supposed to withdraw to. In spite of that, a couple of days ago, there was a series of airstrikes launched by the occupation, bringing the death toll since the ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire on October 10th, to around the 100 person mark. So that's the death toll since the so-called ceasefire on October 10. Also, the average number of aid trucks entering the Gaza Strip each day is at about the 90 mark, which is well below what is supposed to be the daily number of 600 trucks, every day, that was agreed to in the ceasefire agreement. There's more to say on the Palestinian prisoners that have been released since the ceasefire. I'll come back to that, in our next round of questions. But I just wanted to I guess set that up for the audience, and then to throw it to you to ask you, how are you assessing the state of the war on Gaza amidst this so-called ceasefire so far?
So thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I think you set it up pretty well when it comes to describing what has been happening since the ceasefire deal was signed. Um, and when it comes, I think, to understanding what it means, what the word ceasefire means when it comes to Palestinian resistance against the Zionist project and US imperialism, it's important to differentiate between the legal definitions of ceasefire that are internationally accepted and so on by the ICJ or the ICC, the UN, and then the reality on the ground, which is asymmetrical, low intensity warfare that continues until it accelerates again and reaches a point of accelerated genocide or a full-on annihilation campaign like we've seen in the past 2 years. So what's happening right now is that um, the Zionist project funded by the US empire and its allies is attempting to first go back to a state of like the before October 7, which was Gaza being under at that time a 17-year-long air, land, and sea blockade, being an open air prison, being completely besieged by arbitrary colonial borders, and at the same time annex and continue to occupy more land in Gaza and have basically soldiers on the ground, which is a reality that has not happened or existed like in a permanent fashion since 2005 when the Israeli forces were forced to withdraw from Gaza. Um, and with that is their attempt to crush Palestinian resistance as a whole, Palestinian national unity, and the consciousness of resistance that exists, but more specifically, Hamas as a political party, as any form of Hamas's legitimacy in civil life, any form of infrastructure that exists in Gaza that is political, social, civil, so schools, mosques, religious buildings, universities, um, you know, civil society organizations and entities and institutions by returning to a permanent state or an attempt at a permanent state of occupation in Gaza. At the same time, in the occupied West Bank, Zionist forces and the Israeli state has stolen more land in the past 2 years than the amount of land that was annexed in the 1967 June War. So over the past 2 years, while we've been witnessing an annihilation campaign in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank, specifically in the areas where the resistance is strong, and by resistance I mean the armed, like in this case, I'm referring to armed groups or armed factions of political parties. So, for example, the nuclei of resistance really in the West Bank are in Jenin, in Tul Karim, and other places in that strip of land that have been bombed and I mean literally carpet bombed, like carpet bombed. The Jenin refugee camp was essentially almost flattened in an attempt to crush the resistance there, while this accelerated genocide was happening in Gaza. So this return to the status quo with the addition, like simultaneously with the addition of accelerated um, occupation and accelerated land grabs, accelerated annexation of land, but also the return of feet on the ground, soldiers on the ground in Gaza, in what is supposed to be, what they want to be permanently, facilitated by reactionary forces in the region. So we have like Egypt, Jordan is playing a role. Of course, the Gulf states are playing a huge role in facilitating the occupation of Gaza. including today there was news about Jordan, along with Germany, the UK, and other states, actually sending their armed forces to Gaza to maintain, law and order or peace or whatever. And so it's interesting because really with ceasefires in the past in Gaza, the day after was like a return to the status quo of air, land, and sea blockade, a total besiegement, a restriction of mobility, and living in what has been called an open air prison. Right now, the infrastructure that existed within this open air prison is almost entirely annihilated. Like the statistics that have been coming out of Gaza are speaking about 90% of all civilian infrastructure in Gaza being annihilated. And so right now, the people of Gaza are facing, like I think it's important to say that after 2 years of this, annihilation campaign that they've been facing, we're not really at a point where we can say like this is after the war. It's simply a continuation of the war on Gaza, the war on the people of Gaza, but at a lower intensity, um, in an attempt to return like to the status quo.
Thank you for that, my friend. Um, Speaking about the nature of ceasefires today, and as we had mentioned earlier, there's definitely a lot of details to go into on both the legal side and the actual definitions that most of the world upholds, and then of course what the settler colonial states see as a so-called ceasefire. But we just kind of wanted to maybe get a little bit more into the detail of these next coming days, kind of the statements coming out of the resistance groups, how they're responding to the ceasefire, and what the priorities of the people on the ground in Palestine are today, both in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Yeah, so I mean, these are two really important questions. Like, what has been the response of the resistance to this ceasefire proposal, and the violation of the proposal, but also what the people want. Um, Over the past 2 years and since December of 2023, Hamas has, and along with other Palestinian resistance factions, because since then and since before then, this project of national unity has been really important in the Palestinian political terrain. And so Hamas is, leading the negotiations that are mediated with the occupation, mediated by Qatar and Egypt. But other Palestinian factions and political parties have a say in what is decided. And what I'm trying to say is that as of December 2023, like as early as December 2023, all Palestinian political factions were ready and had proposed a ceasefire agreement that had demands, including, of course, the unconditional entry of aid, because by that point, tens of thousands of Palestinians had already been massacred. But also include the lift of the blockade, which is essentially a genocidal blockade on Gaza that had been going on for 17 years. The lift of the maritime blockade, so essentially allowing people in Gaza to travel into the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, to be able to fish, and just, I mean, even if they want to just be there because it's their shore. And so it included demands such as those that were proposed in exchange for releasing all the Israeli prisoners of war. Since then, the US and the Zionist state and the occupation have rejected ceasefire agreements or the ceasefire proposals that had been made by Hamas and agreed upon by Hamas, um, while simultaneously claiming that it's Hamas that is refusing to accept any ceasefire proposal. And so there's two things happening. The priorities of Palestinian political parties, which I think cannot be separated from the Palestinian people, because of course they very much overlap, have been and are to end the bombardment of Gaza, to end the attempt to eliminate Palestinian life and livelihood in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and also to lift the blockade, to lift the siege on Gaza, to allow the entry of unconditional entry of humanitarian aid and so on, but also to create a transitional government. I think they called it at the time in that statement a technocratic government, where Palestinian factions and political parties can run for elections, essentially reforming or replacing the Palestinian Authority, and going towards a more revolutionary path that aligns with the rest of the Palestinian parties. And so that has been, the proposal, right, since December of 2023, and it has been constantly rejected by the US and Israel and anyone who, is mediating on their end, or is allied with their interests, which are total warfare and the total annihilation of the Palestinian people and the occupation of Palestinian land, for many reasons, but primarily because the Israeli state is the most important military outpost for the US in the region. It's the most important imperialist proxy for the US in the region, along with the reactionary regimes that exist surrounding Palestine, and the continuation of the war on Gaza, while continuing to propagate the allegations of falsified allegations of systemic sexual assault on October 7, which had already generated consent for this war on a popular level at that time, was in their interest. Of course, like when you think about it, the US has if your analysis fits within the US as the imperialist state, as the head of the empire, the head of the snake, then it's the one that is essentially controlling Israeli actions or foreign policy or their decisions to continue or end the war, even though in the past 2 years, especially since Trump went into office, there's been discussion about differences between the Israeli state and the US, which is another point that I think is important to get into, because it's really those contradictions that are going to accelerate the unraveling of that relationship between the US empire and its imperialist proxy. But just to speak about the ceasefire agreements themselves and what the Palestinian people want, of course the priority right now is to rebuild Gaza, right? The priority is to rebuild all the civilian and political and social infrastructure that has been annihilated in the past 2 years, and also to regain a sense of life. The latest, I think, statistical study that was released in I think July of 2025 had predicted that with the intensity of the warfare on Gaza, the intensity of the airstrikes, that the death toll during this genocide would have reached 680,000 people. And that's an unfathomable number, right? Of souls and people that have been stolen. And it's also, if we're speaking about a strip of land that is very heavily populated, that had a population of 2.1 million people before the beginning of this accelerated genocide, we're talking about over 25% of the population in Gaza has been completely slaughtered and annihilated. And so really, like, there's this indescribable battle that the people of Palestine and the people of Gaza specifically are facing, which are regaining livelihood after in the day after the genocide, but also rebuilding the infrastructures that sustain this livelihood. And part of genocide and ethnic cleansing, part of the agenda of those settler colonial projects is the annihilation of any life-sustaining sources, any life-sustaining infrastructure. And with that comes this, like, dirty deal with post-ceasefire humanitarian aid and development projects that are being spearheaded by the Gulf states and Jordan and Egypt and so on, of promising to rebuild Gaza. But of course, the undertones of that is that Gaza will never be rebuilt in a sustainable way that promises development and promises abundance and livelihood and being able to live what is supposed to be a normal life, because the interest of those states lies with the occupation, right? It lies with the empire. And so, how many times has Gaza been facing wars since 2005 or 2006? There's 2009, 2011, 2014, 2021, and 2023 until 2025. And these are just the major incidents of assault against Gaza, where infrastructure was destroyed every single time and then, rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. And so it's these, like, what I think are literally like vultures for like that sponsor the humanitarian initiatives in a post ceasefire terrain, like the Gulf states and so on, that are going to be profiting off of the accelerated genocide that the people of Gaza have been facing. These are war profiteers that, now that the war is over, have found a different way to profit off of this genocide at the expense of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to, I guess, build on this conversation about rebuilding the social fabric, the political fabric, after this and after the so-called ceasefire. Part of me also, so, if you want to address this, that would be great. But part of me also wants to ask whether, how certain this, because you're saying this is, a return to, well, maybe not a return, but this is now sort of a phase shift into low intensity genocide. And I wonder how stable that is, and whether there is, I guess there is always prospect for returning to what it looked like before October 10th. So, if you had any brief thoughts on that. But where I wanted to come to was, maybe I'll talk here a little bit about, the Palestinian prisoners, and now with the ceasefire deal, just under 2,000 Palestinian political prisoners have been freed since the ceasefire. This notably does not include Marwan Barghouti from Fatah and Ahmed Sadat from the PFLP, who were listed by the resistance and who wanted them released. These are, as you were saying, potentially, or these were figures that were crucial to bringing together sort of a national political fabric. Additionally, after the ceasefire, Hamas has been, able to reassert its governing authority in Gaza to some extent. Police officers are seen, promoting social order, that kind of thing. And Hamas has also been, targeting and eliminating Israeli-backed armed gangs who were responsible for stealing aid throughout the genocide. And
killing journalists like Saleh Jafrawi, who I guess as a sort of a side note, his brother was imprisoned, and his older brother was imprisoned and released one day after Saleh was assassinated by these gangs. Likely, I mean, who knows, but likely, with Israeli intelligence, the Israelis have wanted him, eliminated for a while now. So, I say all this and provide that context to sort of ask you, what are the prospects for uh, you know, uh, bringing back cohesion to Palestinian politics? Is this too early to discuss? Yeah, what are some of your thoughts on that?
I think, well, first, thank you for bringing up the prisoner exchange being at the top of the resistance's priority, because I forgot to mention that when I mentioned the earliest ceasefire deal. The prisoner exchange was, in exchange for the Israeli prisoners of war, was of course the highest demand, along with stopping the carpet bombing of Gaza and the ground invasion and so on. I think, I personally, I'm not an expert on, policy or a political analyst. And so I feel like I don't have enough knowledge to be able to predict. But also, I think, especially since the martyrdom of Nasrallah in September of 2024 and the martyrdom of Yahya Sinwar in October of 2024, that and also the fall of Syria of Assad in December of 2024. And so those 3 months, I think, have created conditions that I think many of us were not even thinking about as part of what could be coming during the genocide, or even in the next 4, 5, 10 years. And so I think, and this is maybe a bit this is just my personal thoughts, attempts at predicting what comes next on a political level, on a policy level, beyond obviously the big picture of what the US interests, where their interests lie, and where the interests of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance lie, has been a heartbreaking practice, because it feels and it is unconscionable, what has happened in the past 2 years at the most human level is the most inhuman thing, that inhuman thing that we've ever witnessed at this scale, during my lifetime at least, and I think during many people's lifetimes. So the idea of predicting what comes next feels scary, obviously, because the past 2 years have been, the most heart-wrenching 2 years of many people's lives. And I'm just saying this as someone as a Palestinian who is witnessing from afar, not even someone who's enduring the genocide in Gaza. At the same time, I think we can look to past instances of similar instances in Palestinian history where a brutal war was launched against Palestinian people with international impunity when it comes to the Israeli state and the occupation, with also popular and global mobilization in support for the Palestinian people. And I think a noticeable shift in popular sentiment when it comes to the question of Palestine. And I think we can also draw parallels between other times in history where this has happened. I think the most glaring example is the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement at the time, which was crushed by the CIA and counterinsurgency in the US. Sorry, the FBI. I think like we're in a phase right now where like the world was never going to be the same after October 7, 2023, right? And I think if we look to the resistance's press conferences and statements that they had released before October 7, 2023, one of the most important videos that I refer back to is of a press conference in Gaza where Yahya Sinwar was speaking about entering a phase where the occupation and the international community, the world, has two choices. The first is that the Zionist state, Zionist forces, funded and backed by the strongest and most brutal empire in the world, will launch this warfare against the Palestinian people with total impunity and the credibility of international courts of justice or the International Criminal Court or the UN and so on will unravel. And so they will lose all credibility due to their inaction. And the second option is that the Zionist state and Zionism and the project will be isolated to a point where it's no longer in the interest of the world to maintain its presence in the Arab Iranian region and so on. And I think we're at a point where, obviously, I mean, I can't say where we are right now because I think this is sort of a process that will take several years and will become clearer in the years to come. But I think we're somewhere in between the two options right now. And it remains to be seen where we're going to land in a couple of years. But one thing I know for sure is that the UN, the International Criminal Court, the ICJ, and so on have lost a massive amount of credibility. And I think the whitewashing of the international community has become more difficult for them. And the pressure on these international institutions by groups like the Hague Group and so on, and Colombia, the president of Colombia saying that he is, working on an international voluntary army to intervene in the genocide. The civilian flotillas that were sent to Gaza, the intervention of Spain and Italy to a point in protecting those flotillas against Israeli forces. I think those contradictions are sharpening. And at the same time, Zionism, like the idea of Zionism, the Zionist project in popular consciousness, is, I think, going to a point where it's going to be untenable. Like I would hope that in a few years, and even now, that the idea of someone being a Zionist makes them completely open to being or completely prone to being ostracized from civil society and completely marginalized from civil society. The idea of state sponsored schools in the US indoctrinating children, inviting IDF soldiers to give lectures to children, enrolling kids in summer camps that prepare them to enlist in a genocidal army, religious institutions, functioning as a vessel for this ideological Zionist project. I think I would hope that we're reaching a point where just the very existence of those institutions and those entities will become completely unacceptable in civil society. And this is a way to isolate Zionism, to isolate it from all sectors of life, you know. Like when we're talking about art and culture, isolating Zionism in that is important. When we're talking about the academic scene, making Zionism completely untenable and unacceptable and a red line on your campus is a direction that I hope we're heading. And obviously, like the revolution, like the Palestinian revolution, the liberation of the Palestinian people will not come from the belly of the beast or the heart of empire. It will come from Palestine and from the region, from the regional resistance. But we have a very important role to play in isolating Zionism in the heart of the empire that created it and continues to fund it. And I know I went on a very long tangent. I don't know if I answered your question actually, so remind me if I didn't. But yeah, all this to say is that I think if we look back now and in a few years, we'll see that the direction politically of the resistance and Palestinian political parties, besides Fatah and which is, you know, at the head of the Palestinian Authority, and the Oslo group, was preparing us for this moment of sharpening and heightening contradictions to the point of no return. And so we're in, like, the world right now is so different from how it looked on October 6, 2023, because October 7th and what followed was a complete exposure of the lies of human rights institutions, the lie of a universal human rights, you know, protection mission for like these international courts or the UN and so on. And at the same time, I think it exposed the relationship between the US empire and the Zionist state, not for the first time, of course, not for the first time, but to a point where it has become undeniable that the maintenance of the Zionist state as a military outpost in our region is at a priority. It is the priority right now for the empire, to the point where domestically the acceleration of fascism and the you know, what is called the imperial boomerang, and the turning back of imperialist and colonial violence on the American people is a fair exchange for the political elite, as long as they get to maintain their interests in expanding US hegemony and maintaining their proxies in our region.
I know you said you went on a rant, but that's perfectly appropriate and appreciated. I think you did a fantastic job of not only answering that question, but really opening up my next one. So if it's acceptable to the both of you, if you'll allow me to just share a few comments in response to what you just said before I get to the question. I think first of all, you know, the mention that the world is forever going to be a different place. It was supposedly clear to many on the left and many in the world that the question of armed resistance had been eliminated and that this was no longer a possibility. And yet here on October 7th, we have a very clear example. And since then, that in fact, even in the most asymmetrical situations, people who are organized and unified, not only against an enemy, but with a shared national project in mind, the technological and military advancements they're up against are not necessarily the strongest vector they're dealing with. It tends to be, as we're saying, international opinion and action. And so that brings me to my second point. You know, you were talking about just the absolute disgusting brutality of even just the first few days and months after October 7th, and how many lives we've lost since. And it made me think about a comment that Max Isle made in one of our recent discussions here on the show, where he said October 7th necessarily had to be a top secret mission, which was even kept away from other axis of resistance nations. Because ultimately, as you said, the liberation of Palestine can and only will come from the Palestinian people themselves. And so that brings me to my question. We know how imperialism works, or at least the three of us here have a general concept that, of course, the overt militaristic slaughter is one part, but there are other ways that imperialism functions, such as in Lebanon or against Cuba, for example. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, I don't want like predictions per se, as you were saying, it's a very difficult and heartbreaking exercise. But what I would maybe like to hear is your thoughts on what those of us outside of Palestine should be doing to prepare for this next wave of attack in different form, through political persecution, legal persecution, and just the attempt to further divide domestic populations, such as here on occupied Turtle Island.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think before I answer your question, you mentioned something really important, which is that the technological superiority of the occupier and the colonizer and the empire is not the most difficult battle, or is not always the most difficult battle that the colonized have to face, not just in Palestine, but in general. And you reminded me of this text that was published by the Popular Front, the PFLP, in 1970 or 71, about their military strategy. And essentially, it was a collection of questions and answers from Al-Hadaf, which was the media organ of the PFLP, whose editor-in-chief was Hassan Kanafani, and the PFLP responding to those questions. And one of the recurring themes in that text is the idea of psychological warfare. The question of the colonial psyche and the colonial imagination, I think, like lies at the heart of what Yahya Sinwar was saying before October 7th, about giving the occupation and the world two choices. And it has been, one of the most important battles that Palestinians and the Palestinian people have fought since the beginning of the occupation of Palestine. Even, back then when the PLO and the Palestinian resistance factions were in Lebanon before being exiled, the idea of destroying this sense of colonial invincibility that exists in the settler psyche, in the settler imagination, but also in the imagination of their sponsors, like the US empire, is one of the most important goals that the resistance can achieve. And I think it's important to mention that since October 7, one of the main ways that that the world has changed for the colonizer, for the Israeli colonizer, and for the settler is that, with all this warfare that has been carried out in their name by them, with all the slaughter, the destruction of infrastructure in Gaza, the annexation of more land in the West Bank, the lobbying that they do in the West, the attempt to crush the movement for Palestine across the globe, the Israeli settler and colonizer has never felt less safe than they do right now, because they realize that what they are fighting is they realize now more than ever that what they're fighting is an existential threat. And it has always been an existential threat. And when you think of it dialectically, like Palestinians are facing an existential threat from the Zionist project, and to be able to win against or to overcome this existential threat. As a result, the colonizer and the settler himself will also have to face this threat. And so they have never felt less safe than they do right now, because I think something has shifted in the colonial imagination in a way that it hasn't in the past few decades. And I think, honestly, in the way that it hasn't since probably 2006, with the war in Lebanon, the victory that Hezbollah achieved over the occupation, since 2000, when they withdrew from South Lebanon and the South was liberated. But also, like, since 1968, when they were defeated in a 2-day or 3-day long battle in the Battle of Karame, which happened on Jordanian land, when Palestinian forces and Jordanian armed forces, like the actual Jordanian army, collaborated to defeat Zionists. And this psychological setback should be like at the top of our list when we think about, okay, what do we do in the heart of empire? Like, what is our role in the belly of the beast? First, there's all these, incredible initiatives that are happening, that are tackling the Zionist project from every avenue, and a diversity of tactics is obviously important. And so there's the legal warfare, lawfare. There is the movement, like the mass mobilizations, like getting on the street. There's all these boycott and divestment campaigns, forcing your universities to divest from the occupation. But also, at the risk of being redundant, there's the isolation of Zionism in civil society, like in society. The isolation of Zionist ideology as an acceptable form of living your life, as an acceptable way to live your life. The isolation of dual citizen soldiers that leave and commit and participate in a genocide in Palestine, and then come back to Canada or the US or Holland or Germany or wherever, and walk in our streets, walk between us, walk next to us on the street, and we may run into them and they're living their life normally. I think refusing to accept this reality is something that we need to prioritize, because the reality is that those people that are participating in the annihilation of the Palestinian people, in the occupation of Palestinian land, in the bombardment of Lebanese land and Lebanese people, in the war on Iran, in accelerating regional warfare, are coming back here to live their life as if they're safe. And I think bringing back this idea of psychological warfare, like it's actually unacceptable, in the most severe sense, to have been a participant in the most brutal live streamed genocide that we've witnessed in decades, and then return and live your life and go with business as usual. And now, like, this reminds me of a project by a journalist and a friend, Davide, who is an editor at The Maple, who did so much research to create this website that's called findidfsoldiers.net. And also the work of, Hind Rajab Foundation, who is identifying even criminals, like, seems like too light of a word, but like the criminals that participated in the murder of Hind Rajab, the six-year-old girl who was killed with 355 bullets in Gaza, along with the paramedics that were sent to save her life, that are unmasking who these soldiers are, that are identifying where they're living, where they work, and taking them to court but also just erasing the idea in their imagination of a completely normal life after the fact. And I think this can be tackled in many ways. Like, of course, there is the investigative piece of like uncovering who these people are, but also just trying in our in our organizations, and hopefully people are organized to think of ways to make Zionism unacceptable in all of our spaces, not just in Palestinian community organizations, obviously, or Palestinian or organizations that are explicitly organizing for Palestine. This is a task for all of us, right? Recently, a recent practice in the IDF has been soldiers taking their pictures with their badges hidden and their faces turned away. And we should take that to heart, right? Like they are afraid because there is a deep understanding that the world is against them, despite the role that states, like Canada and the US and the UK and so on have been playing, that the people that like at a popular level are against the existence of a Zionist political project on Arab land in the way that in the form that it exists today. But I mean, hopefully, just at all, like just the existence of Zionism at all. And so it's not just that like I'm predicting, this psychological warfare or referring to like a shift in the colonial imagination out of like, wishful thinking. It is a reality for the for Zionist forces themselves, that covering their faces, that hiding their names will maintain their safety. And that, I think highlights the importance of projects like Find IDF Soldiers.net or the Hind Rajab Foundation, and any initiatives that are trying to uncover IDF soldiers that participated in the war on Gaza.
And we're glad to see it. We're glad to see them scared. And hopefully this leads to, lower recruitment numbers. Hopefully this leads to chaos in the settler colony there and here, because we ultimately benefit from the downfall of these fascistic societies. But I did just want to take a moment and ask this last question before, unfortunately, I do have to step away. It was an honor to speak with you, my friend. I'm glad to have been able to talk. But you mentioned contradictions, and you mentioned how the National Unity Project, along with psychological warfare, meaning both inside and outside of the Strip and in the Palestinian territory. So I wanted to kind of get your impression from the successful reconciliation of contradictions that the different Palestinian factions, political parties, and groups of people have been able to develop. How can we here in the West, thinking of the United States, of so-called Canada and Europe, how can we take this practice of critique and self-critique, reconciling contradictions, or isolating those who cannot be reconciled with, given that there are these historical contradictions within these settler colonial projects here?
I mean, first, it was great to talk to you as well. And I think that's a very important question to think about, because what we've witnessed over the past year and a half, especially since or just a year, especially since Biden stepped down and Kamala decided to run as the presidential nominee for the Democrats, is and it kind of felt like whiplash at the time, like is a complete just like turn from, fuck the Democrats and the duopoly and the bipartisan, lie and so on, to this idea of the lesser of two evils. And now that Biden is gone, like Kamala's policies will be different, or the Democrats are trying their hardest to or what AOC was saying about we're trying our hardest behind the scenes to bring a ceasefire. At the same time, I think the acceleration of fascist violence in the US domestically, the acceleration of repression and militarization in the US can bring about two, outcomes. I mean, many outcomes, but the two that I'm thinking about are, one is people are going to join the struggle because they realize that fascism and imperialist violence and colonial violence is being turned inwards, and the destruction of empire is not only beneficial for the people of the third world, which should be, the primary concern for people living in the belly of the beast, but also beneficial for domestically within the belly of the beast for people that have been historically oppressed and destitute and marginalized by the state. The second scenario that I think of is that people are going to commit to this idea of lesser of two evils, and in the next round of elections, the Democrats will have a revival of at least we're not Trump. Like the main policy or selling point is, at least we're not the conservatives in Canada, or at least we're not the Republicans in the US. And popular education first is an important part of combating this. Not many people know that the Democratic Party as it exists today is in many ways, if not most ways, if not totally, to the right of George Bush's policies in the early 2000s. And so the Democratic Party will effectively be a more right-wing government than the Republicans during the war on terror. But also that the acceleration of fascist violence here in the empire is not a unique characteristic of the Republican Party or a unique characteristic of the Trump campaign or the Trump presidency. I think really the only difference is that it's just being done more honestly and less politely than it would have been done under the Democrats or under the liberals in Canada or under the Labour Party in the UK and so on. And so the question becomes how do you fight against that second scenario? How do you fight against this complete internalization of the idea of lesser of two evils, rather than the biggest evil and the one evil is the empire. And lately, I've been thinking a lot about revolutionary defeatism as one of the practices that needs to be adopted collectively by organizations that are based in the US and are attempting to fight the empire explicitly, at least, or implicitly. The defeat of the US empire, the defeat of its tentacles that are launching these wars of aggression on our land, that are wreaking havoc on our land and our people, stealing our resources, displacing millions and millions and millions of people, if not billions, since the 90s and the early 2000s, is in the interest of the American people or the American nation or the Canadian nation. And the explicit adoption of revolutionary defeatism is what I hope to see as these contradictions sharpen and as they heighten, because it should, the destruction of the US empire should be on the agenda, because how are you going to secure, I don't know, migrant rights, or without the destruction of the empire that creates these migrants in the first place due to imperialist violence and the expansion of US hegemony? How do you secure I don't know, like more money for education, and schools and lower tuition, free schools, free higher education for your people, if the empire that is spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on militarized expansion all over the world is simply does not exist and is instead, first of all, not an empire, but also, rerouting and repurposing all that wealth towards community and education and so on. And so it's simple things like this, right? Like, like why is food so expensive? Why are schools so inaccessible? Why are there food deserts in the wealthiest country in the world that imports everything from people of the third world, who are being paid slave wages, only to import them into the US and still have food deserts in the middle of this most powerful nation? I think like the realization, like a deep, deep realization of the evil of this empire is one of the most important tasks to come. And at the center of that is revolutionary defeatism, in my opinion.
Thanks for that, Tara. I think that's a good place to leave it. I really appreciate your time. Could you perhaps just let the audience know, where they can find your work or anything else you'd like to plug or shout out?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I don't know what to plug except I just have a Substack, and it's Tara Alami at .substack.com, where I occasionally send newsletters. And then yeah, I think just keep up with the organizations and the websites that I mentioned, like Find IDF Soldiers and the Hind Rajab Foundation, Palestinian Feminist Collective, Palestinian Youth Movement, the student movement, the SJPs. I think this is way more important than anything that I could plug for myself.
Thank you again.